Let me welcome everyone. First of all, I see a lot of familiar faces. I know many of you have been joining in these Monday Musings for the last year or so, but I think we have some new faces tonight. So just in the interest of that, just to introduce kind of what we're doing here. This is a series called Monday Musings, and every Monday, be it by live Zoom like tonight, or receiving an email with some pre-recorded videos and materials, you get something each week, and each month is kind of focused around something specific. So today is March 1st, and we are focusing on landscapes, and more specifically, more sustainable type landscaping. And that's kind of what we're going to be touching on the 5 Mondays in March. We do have 2 live Zooms this month. The next one is going to be March 22nd, and that is on our Easter holiday plants and kind of some of the historic lore, the symbolism that kind of coincides with the holidays, but we're also going to check out some of our Appalachian Spring ephemerals, kind of identify some of those and kind of how they go along with the holiday too. I'm thinking about actually doing our March 15th class live. When I send out your email after tonight's class, I'm going to put that in there, a little survey to vote yes or no. If everybody wants to do that, all I was going to do for that night is show you actual pictures, because some of the resources that I'm sharing with you are not going to have those really pretty pictures. It's going to have the list of what the plan is and give you descriptors. But what I was going to do for March 15th is actually share some of those pictures so you can kind of see what those would look like in the landscape. So y'all just think about that. If that's something y'all want to join for, I don't mind coming on and doing a live Zoom on that March 15th. So if you are new tonight, just a couple of things, housekeeping. Everybody, make sure your microphones are muted. If you have questions as we move through tonight, pop those in the chat box. And we have Jenny Thompson on here. She's one of our Big Spring Master Gardeners, so she'll be kind of manning that, answering questions as we go, what she can and what she can't. I pull those out and answer those and return those answers to you in our follow-up email. You'll also get links to our Google Drive where these resources are housed, but then also the link to the website where I'm trying to migrate all of this information to as well. So you'll be able to obtain those resources in multiple venues, kind of depending on your preference. Let me think, is there anything else? Just know that you will, like I say, get that email with all the links, the video recording, and all of that good stuff. So any questions you have, again, put those in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully. It has been a Monday, y'all. Okay. All right, Deborah, I'm picking on you because I can see you. Can you see my screen? Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, good deal. Whoops, I forgot to put that first slide on this a little bit earlier. But again, tonight our focus is sustainable landscaping. So what I kind of want to do with tonight is kind of set the framework, if you will, for the next month, but also kind of show how we as humans and how wildlife and how our landscape, we can all work in tandem together with the environment. So we're going to move through a lot of different principles and components. So again, don't hesitate to put those questions in the chat box, because I think most of this is pretty straightforward, but just trying to keep it kind of simple and hopefully at least whet everybody's appetite, maybe rethink some things you may be currently doing at home. So when I think about sustainable landscaping, I kind of compare it to a balance beam, and you can kind of see these 4 dots up here: nature, budget, community, and lifestyle. So, you know, when we think about the home landscape, I kind of compare it to farmers or gardeners when we are utilizing cover crops and crop rotation. We're using some of those common practices, or as a forester, maybe managing those healthy timber stands, or just how we at home have maybe our own personal family budget, and we strive to maintain those personal finances. All of those things kind of dependent on our personal lifestyle and philosophy is kind of how we define a sustainable landscape. So when we look at the Merriam-Webster definition, it's one that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, before we get into much further, I guess, I just want to stress the fact that For each one of us on here tonight, and how many of us, I don't see that number now, but there was over 100 of you on here a few minutes ago. Each one of you are going to have a different idea of what a sustainable landscape is going to look like. As long as you're adhering to these components and principles, that's going to be what is key, but it's going to look different for each and every one of us. Each one of us are going to have different plant preferences. We're each one going to have different soil types. Some of us are going to live in the mountains. Some of us are going to live out on the Mississippi River. You know, there's just going to be a lot of things that are kind of going to define what we can and cannot do in our own personal landscape. And a lot of that's just going to be personal preference. But another good thing to remember is that your house, your property, it's not in this bubble. You're a part of a much larger ecosystem. And even those of us living in subdivisions or those of us living on farms, whatever the case may be, we're still part of that larger ecosystem. Everything that we're doing on our property is somehow affecting everything else in some way. So again, it's going to look different to each one of us. You've got to have an idea of what you want from that outdoor space. You got to figure out a way how to incorporate these elements to make it work for you and the property. Again, we're kind of working in tandem. And the thing about these sustainable landscapes, we don't want to have to be killing ourselves working to maintain those year after year. We want to get it to the point that the landscapes are working for us and not against us, if that makes sense. So basically, it's just about striving to obtain balance for the long term. And maintenance in return is just going to be a little bit more low key as we get that landscape established. So when we think about sustainable landscaping, this is just a question out of the gate. Are any of you doing these things? You know, are you composting? Are you thinking about your water resources? How are you managing those? Do you have water on your property? A stream, a pond, any type of water? Are you protecting that water's edge? Are you reducing runoff? Are you growing organically, and are you recycling yard waste? If you're doing any of these, then you're already practicing some form of sustainable landscaping. Now, this is a really busy slide, and there's a lot going on here, and I did that on purpose just to make y'all's mind boggle. But the thing about a sustainable landscape is that it changes. And that's one reason I did this slide, because, you know, when we first go to maybe transitioning from our current landscape into a more sustainable landscape, or we build a house, we buy a new property, whatever the case may be, when we start putting our personality and our own spin on this landscape, what it looks like today is not going to look that same way a year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years down the road. And we've got to be able to vision that out and kind of, again, make that work for us in the long run. So think about the types of trees, be it deciduous or the evergreens. Think about vines if you're trying to hide something in a corner of your landscape. Think about your sunlight and your site needs and all those type things. Just remember that all of this is going to change over time. So as we move into goals, some of the things we want to keep in mind is some of the same things we're talking about in gardening all the time. We just want to promote good soil health. You know, y'all have heard me before in many other classes. I say it all the time. Everything starts with good soil. You know, I don't try to sell the soil test, but I will tell you that it's imperative, especially if you're, you know, just moving into a new house or buying a house. Make sure you know what that baseline soil test is, because it's going to kind of determine some of the things you can and can't plant in that landscape, or it's going to dictate how much amending that you need to do the soil depending on what plants you're wanting to plant. But when we're promoting good soil health, we're also controlling erosion as well. We're protecting those downstream waterways. So basically, it's our own stormwater management system in place on our property. Some of you I know try to deter landscape or wildlife from your landscape, but some actually want to bring those in. So again, this is going to kind of differ from person to person. Some of you may try to deter wildlife to no avail. That's just going to be how it's going to work. But there are some plants that you can incorporate in your landscape that's going to maybe deter the little bunny rabbits or even repel deer. So, and I'll share some of those resources with you later. But we want to be able to minimize any kind of intensive landscaping practices because again, it's about time management as well, and they're not really going to give you big bang for your buck. So the ultimate goal is just keeping it low maintenance. So some of the elements is just, again, getting intimate with your site, whether you've lived there 20 years or not, just really knowing everything underfoot, knowing all your soil, what's going on in that landscape that's going to kind of, again, dictate what you can and can't do. So, and I guess I'll just kind of share with you a little bit just to maybe illustrate from my own personal house. I've lived there 20 years, and I guess I was kind of odd when I bought the house. When I saw the picture of the house, like I told my realtor, I didn't even want to go see that house, and he still took me by this house, and it was quite accidental, but I couldn't see the landscape in the picture, and I'm so glad he took me there because that's really what sold me on the house. I have a lot of limestone rock outcrops, and some people that would drive crazy. It did my ex-husband, you know, because I have all these huge big rocks, but I saw that as, you know, just a canvas. There was nothing there in existence, and I thought, wow, you know, I can really work with this. So I'm kind of backwards, I guess, because my garden area is in the side front portion of my house. So it's not like right in front of my house, but it's to the side and to the front, because that's the only place those limestone rock outcrops would allow me to be able to till and plant my garden. And also where my rocks are at, I have a lot of shade, and that was what I was going for. Even 20 years ago, before I really understood a lot about some of my native perennials and the medicinal edibles, I knew I liked those plants and I wanted to incorporate those into my landscape. So this was perfect for me. And I've gotten my landscape to where I really like it, and I've got those planted, and that met my goal, and I'm doing that sustainably. So even before sustainable landscapes was cool, some of us were probably doing that, y'all, and we just didn't know it. But again, it goes back to understanding your site, knowing what you want, and then just being able to minimize all these inputs that you see on number 3 here. We talk about water all the time, you know, for our garden. Many of you have heard me say all the time about overhead watering, how wasteful that is. If we can get some kind of drip irrigation in there, that's going to help reduce overflow. When we build and create this biodynamic landscape, we're reducing the needs for some of these inputs like fertilizers and any of these chemical pesticides, especially herbicides. You don't have to mow as much. Weed eat, for me, weed eating is therapy, but not everybody likes to do that. So kind of converting your lawn into actual landscape that you're not having to mow. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the main components, and I've touched on these, but again, to reiterate, do a soil test. That's going to give you the baseline, especially, again, in my instance, I had a lot of shade. I had those lime rock outcrops. I suspected my pH was lower, a little bit on the acidic side, and it was, in fact, which would be perfect for azaleas and rhododendrons, some of those native species. But know where that, you know, what that pH is, because it's going to be more conducive for a lower pH, and you might not need to amend certain areas of your landscape. Organic matter, that's going to tell you a lot too. We all probably battle the red clay. We know that clay is good because it carries that negative charge, and it's going to help bind some of that other fertility and nutrition to where plants can actually utilize whatever inputs we're putting on them. But if we have a higher organic matter content, then that's going to help all of that nutrient cycling and water and all of that good stuff. So a soil test is going to help deem that as well. Whether you are no-till or strip till or tilling, it's still about maintaining that soil health. Mulching practices, any of those type things are going to help encourage microbes. Again, that's all about the biodiversity of the landscape. And it's also going to help reduce erosion. As far as water, just always being energy conscious. Know that everything is in fact going to be connected by water. If you're in the state of Tennessee, you know that Tennessee is a water-rich state. So always be looking for opportunities to be able to inhibit some of that water runoff. Know that a lot of our streams and wetlands are going to offer site-specific plant options, and I'm going to share those with you tonight, and we're going to have a class dedicated to rain gardens later in the year. As far as creating a sense of place, just make it consistent. You know, if we want to draw pollinators in, we don't want to be confusing them. They're going to thrive when they can actually have consistent access to those native pollinators that actually benefit them in the long run. And this is just going to enhance those natural elements. And whether you're in Tennessee or not, it's going to showcase your native plants wherever you're joining from tonight. Diversity, you don't want the same old. It goes right back to some of our production ag systems. Monoculture is not a good thing. So the more that we can plan for diversity, the better off we're going to be. Plus, it's going to give us that pop of visual appeal. It's going to maximize wildlife benefits. And then you see there, minimizes vulnerability to large-scale loss of a single plant species due to disease. You know, plant resistance, disease resistance, and that kind of thing. All right, so the next few slides, we're going to go through each one of these bullets. And just hang with me because some of this might be a little bit boring, but I want to kind of show you each one of these elements just to kind of get you thinking about things. And we'll talk more about some of these plants a little bit later. But you can see back here, this is what we would call a windbreak or a shelter belt. And when we have these on our property, it's helping us conserve energy. It's going to control drifting snow. That's not going to be as big an issue for some of us as it is for others. But even in East Tennessee in the last, or West Tennessee in the last couple of weeks, we've seen where that might actually be a benefit. They're going to provide food and shelter for wildlife. If you've got a neighbor you don't want to be looking in on and vice versa, these are going to provide that opportunity. And it's going to create that microclimate that can benefit plant health. Now, one of these things, just because we're on this slide, a lot of folks want to use the famous Leyland cypress, but we've got lots of alternatives for that. And again, if you're into the native landscaping, there's more sustainable options than some of the tried and true Leylands. Some options that may grow a little bit slower, but they're still going to provide the same type of shelter belt, maybe just takes a little bit longer to get there. If you look at number 2 here, you can kind of see how we've got this gradually mounded soil here. That's what we call a berm. And these can be multiple different sizes in your landscape, just kind of depending on what you're going for. But it's going to give you like a little walling effect. And it can kind of enhance some of that visual appeal. It can help improve drainage if that's an issue. That's one reason that I have that. It's not really for visual appeal. It's just because I need to be able to improve drainage in a couple of sites in my landscape. It's also going to provide a little bit of opportunity if you have a poor soil area where you don't have a lot of good drainage, and we know like a gray or a yellow soil is going to tell us that you have a poor drainage problem. So a berm would be a good thing to incorporate in that instance. This here would be our ornamental grasses. Ornamental grasses are really tough, especially our native species. And I've got a slide here in a few minutes that's going to speak to that a little bit more, but especially for wildlife, if that's one thing you're going for, it provides some excellent cover, gives you some pretty cool visual interest. This is something that's really come on in the last decade, I guess. The ornamental grasses are growing in popularity. The ground cover, you can kind of see this here on a slope. So you can tell that'd be a really hard area to mow in your landscape. So incorporating some kind of green ground cover, that's going to eliminate the need for that. It's going to lessen precipitation runoff. So if this was just bare ground, what's going to happen when it rains? All of that's going to go right into the stream, the pond, whatever, and it's going to go really fast and you're losing a lot of soil. So again, really encourage you to look at some of those living ground covers. I don't know if you can tell this from here or not, but just grouping similar plants into masses, that's going to give you a stronger visual impact instead of having just a wall of the same thing. Now on a shelter belt, you would want that, but if you're planting on down into your landscape, just creating visual impact and diversity. It's just copying what when we walk into the woods on a hike, it's just basically mimicking nature in that regard. Number 6, you can see here, these are illustrating turf grasses. So there might be a couple of locations in your landscape that require different turf. High traffic area, is going to require a different type of turf than a lower trafficked area. You can get away with some even cheaper alternatives there, and I'm going to provide you some resources with some of those a little bit later. But also, if you have a really shady area, utilizing a different turf that's going to be better suited for those shade conditions is also going to give you a little bit more coverage and a little bit more sustainability in the long term. Again, same thing with the turf grasses here. And then using organic mulch, that's just going to, any kind of mulching, that's going to help us retain soil temperature. It's going to help us conserve that soil moisture. In an instance like this morning, I woke up and, you know, we were flooded here in East Tennessee. I mean, it went away pretty quickly by lunchtime. But still, you know, that's anytime we have that mulch, or even plants in certain instances are going to be kind of a mulch bed, and it's going to kind of help slow that water flow. And plus, mulch is just going to give you a really nice contrast to the landscape, and it increases that organic matter content as well. Okay, so oh, whoops, sorry, wrong slide. A few more elements here. Number 9, you can see here that this is just an irrigation system that they've installed. It's going to be there on a permanent basis. And so that way it's going to reduce the amount of water being utilized. Again, kind of grouping these similar, or plants with similar water needs. That way you're going to avoid under and over watering. We don't want to be planting shade plants with full sun plants. Make sure that we understand what these families of plants are before we place those in the landscape. And again, just the drip irrigation. If you've got a rock garden, any kind of steep slope that you know, just maybe you're installing junipers on a hill or something like that, incorporating some kind of water system, which is going to maintain the life of those plants if we got into a droughty year, but also help keep that moisture level even, especially in a graded slope area. Again, just make sure when you purchase plants, and I'm bad for this because I do have more shade. So when I do find plants that I like in full sun, I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with this plant. Surely it'll be okay in the shade, but you know, it doesn't take long for that plant to say, no, we don't like it here. We don't like it here at all. And it'll start stretching and, you know, growing toward what little bit of sunlight comes in, and I end up digging them up and sharing with friends or something. So always make sure you know what those conditions are. If we landscape vertically, as nature does, again, just mimicking what Mother Nature does, incorporating all these elements. Just think about it. If you walk into the woods, what that looks like. Same thing. Of course, we don't want to be planting ground covers that are going to take over the universe, like, you know, Heterohelix or the periwinkles, or that winter creeper Euonymus. So be really thoughtful when you do think about some of those ground covers. Again, creating those wildlife habitats to draw in your birds. One thing about the ornamental grasses earlier, or any of those perennial flowers that you might have, or herbs. If you're a neat freak like me and a little bit OCD, the first thing I want to do in October, November is go out there and clean all that up. But I make myself leave that because that's good forage for the birds. It's good cover for the birds, and you'll just maintain those bird populations throughout the winter. Having that compost bin, a compost site, or a compost bin on site is going to be really helpful. Managing that through the season, and again, you're just returning those elements to the earth. We've gotten into this upcycling, utilizing trash. One man's trash is another man's treasure. So some of those things, you can incorporate those not only in your landscape, but also in your garden beds through the summer months, you know, planting in old tires or old buckets or old gutters, old pallets, any of those type things, you can kind of take and incorporate those in the landscape to provide a benefit. And then just manipulating the microclimates, just using some of these overhead vines and trees. Make sure if you get the wisteria, it's not the crazy Asian one that takes over the universe, you know, things like that. Just again, making sure you know which plants you're incorporating. Using raised beds. This is not just for gardens, but this can be used in the landscape. You can kind of hide some of those, and I'm going to show you an example of these a little bit later. But if you've got an area with poor soil, it's a great way to incorporate a raised bed. And then just use plantings to connect your landscape with what lies beyond. You know, for some that might be farmland, for some that might be forest land. I know here in Greene County, a lot of folks back up to the Cherokee National Forest. Some people are going to back up, like I say, to their farm. Some of you may be in subdivisions with fence, but whatever it is, just kind of let your landscape blend with whatever is near you. Okay, so how are some ways that you can adapt moving forward into this sustainable landscape? Well, we've already talked about composting. That's one of the biggies. We talk about composting a lot for our vegetable gardens and our herb gardens, flower gardens, but you can use this in all of your landscape beds as well. Going back to the soil test, you know, if you've got an area that's, you know, really low in organic matter, this is one way to help improve that soil health over time. We talked about those native grasses a little while ago. Now there's a lot of ornamental grasses on the market, but I wanted to mention these native grasses, the big blue stem, the Indian grass, the little blue stem, and switchgrass. So if you're incorporating these natives, you can kind of see here on the switchgrass how that's a clumping grass. It does get really tall. Actually, I don't know if y'all can see behind me, but that's switchgrass. That's behind my head back there. But anyway, these are clumping grasses, so this is great for like bobwhites and quail, smaller wildlife. It provides a great habitat, great cover for these. And the cool thing about this, you can just whack them off this time of year in the springtime. I let these go through the winter again just to provide that cover, but they grow back really, really fast. Now, another way you can adapt, and some of the master gardeners on here will recognize this. Tennessee was the spotlight state at the Sunbelt Ag Expo in 2017, and yours truly got to design the exhibit. So this was my design. And I say this because it's kind of like that first slide or two that I said, you know, make sure that you know what your landscape can do, get acquainted with it, you know, get intimate with your landscape, kind of vision out, know where all the puzzle pieces are going to fit. Well, I know what this says. It's not my fault that nobody else didn't understand it, but I understood perfectly what it meant. But one of our master gardeners actually helped kind of put that into a better perspective to where my bosses and colleagues felt a little bit better about the situation. But you know, having a plan and drawing this out, and you can see here that this is in pencil. You don't have to be perfect. And that's one reason that I show these two slides, because everybody thinks you have to put this on AutoCAD or whatever and draw this precise plan. And for some, you may be well suited to do that. For me, not so much. So, but just drawing out the basics and do it in pencil, because that landscape might shift a little bit. So make it to where you can go back and forth and erase and change, and you're always going to know what, you know, what plant you have where, what your soil is, any kind of conditions, where your water and all that good stuff is on your property. Create that checklist. Just make a plan of practical actions, you know, kind of keep this as your little Bible that you work through each year, because you're not going to be able to do this in one year. When you start building a sustainable landscape, it takes time to get there, because remember, we're starting it now and we're investing into the future. So it's going to change. Keeping that checklist is just going to kind of keep you on track. And just remember to be flexible, because again, things can change. Mother Nature throws us curveballs all the time. But just kind of, you know, keep it in your mind that some of these things might not be able to be incorporated, because again, your landscape's going to dictate some things, but just kind of be ready to roll with the punches, kind of like we've all been doing with COVID in the last year. So one thing I want to kind of hit on and kind of whet your appetite for next week, and some of you that are master gardeners in Tennessee have probably seen this numerous times, and we're not going to do the activity tonight, but because we're going to save that for next week. But just knowing your watershed, and you know what exactly is a watershed. And the reason that we bring this up in sustainable landscape is because it is an integral part of you. Remember at the beginning I said your house, and you're not just in a bubble. Well, watersheds are basically showing us that connection between land and water. And you can kind of see how we've got all this flow on this slide here. So the topography of the landscape is going to kind of define how water moves through it. And you can kind of see how how this is moving here. You know, rainfall from this morning. We can see how all this flow is coming on down, and it's just reflecting the nature of the land that drains to it. So basically, actually, let me go to the next slide. So like I say, you're going to see this next week and you'll be able to kind of pinpoint. If you're in Tennessee, now if you're not in Tennessee, this little widget thing is not going to work for y'all, but that doesn't mean that you can't participate next week. But it is kind of cool. So I just kind of, again, want to introduce it tonight. But you can see here, if you've been getting emails from me, you see in my signature line that I have my watershed address here. I have it for both home and office. So Boones Creek actually runs right there behind my property, and it feeds into the Holston French Broad watershed. Okay, so from my little house, any of that water from this morning, if I'm not taking care to protect that water's edge, then anything that I've done on my property is running right into Boones Creek, and then it's running on down to the French Broad. The French Broad feeds into Douglas Lake, and then, you know, French Broad comes out at the dam there and eventually flows on and meets the Holston River right outside of Knoxville to form the Tennessee River. Tennessee River flows to the Mississippi and on down to the Gulf. So that's just the big picture of even the little things that we're doing at home can actually protect everything on downstream. And that's kind of what our watershed is. So in the PowerPoint, you can click on this. If you're in Tennessee, punch in your address and it's going to tell you just like this what your watershed address is. But again, we'll touch more on that for next week, but I just want you to keep that in mind as we talk about sustainability. Again, that's the big picture. Another big picture is removing those invasive species, and you've heard me mention a few of those. The winter creeper euonymus, for instance, and I know this one well because I battle it all the time. I've been battling it for 20 years, and I've just decided that it's just always going to be something on my property unless I come in there with some really serious herbicides, and I don't really want to do that because, again, Boones Creek, big pond right there, and I just don't want to be doing that. Plus, I've kind of built up my aquatic species over time, the frogs and things, and I just don't want to be doing that. So I'll live with a little bit of the invasive. But there are chemical methods to get some of those under control. And maybe some of you are asking, what is an example of an invasive? Why are they detrimental? Why do we need to add natives? And don't worry, we're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks on that March 15th. And then I think it's sometime in July, we're really going to hit on invasives and natives. But this is a good place to interject here with the Bradford pear, also known as the Callery pear. So again, I'll use myself as an example just to show you that, you know, you can have good intentions, but sometimes, you know, whatever. I bought my house and there were 3 of these in front of my house. Okay, I bought my house in 2001. How many Bradford pears do I have left now? Did I do that? No, I did not. I did it on purpose. I kind of let Mother Nature take care of them. So I was actually down to 1.5 tree at one point, and then I was down to a half tree because I'm just like, I'm doing my own little experiment. How long is it going to take? Well, they're just horrible, y'all. These were not self-pollinating trees. They were created for this beautiful bloom, but they stink really bad. I don't know if y'all have ever noticed that. But then when cross-pollination started occurring and then birds started eating them and dropping them everywhere, then the Callery pear became a really quick invasive species. So from the 3 trees that someone had planted before I bought my house, I ended up with Callery pears like everywhere behind the house. And it's just been a nightmare. And you know that when they spread from like the roots too. So even when you cut that trunk, you have to be really careful to, you know, I'll confess, I did use a little Roundup on the stump because I kept having those runners run into my garden area. So this is just an example of a Bradford pear. This is what they're known for, but we have alternatives for that. So just know that if you do like this tree, we do have some other plants that are going to be better suited. And anytime that we can plant a native tree, then that's going to be better because a native is adapted to our local environment. So it's kind of just like we are. We adapt to certain climates and conditions and environment, and plants are the same way. So when we think about those Callery pears or Bradford pears, we've got a lot of options. And some of you heard me talk about like the serviceberry, Juneberry, whatever you call that, wherever you're from, a few weeks ago in Cool Fruits. Well, you can see what that looks like. It's got some really pretty white foliage. It's going to bloom early in the spring. Plus you're going to get fruit off of that, and it's not going to break out. It's going to be a lot hardier. Several others are listed here, so this is just one example. One of your resources tonight, and this is something March 15th, if we join back together, we'll go through some of these alternatives for some of these trees, because I do want to mention the Leyland cypress again, and our, let's see, the burning bush, the euonymus. They call that winged euonymus, I think. But even some of those plants, coming up with some of these alternatives is better in the long run. And you even heard me talk about the chokeberry and the chokecherry a couple of weeks ago too. So a lot of alternatives for the Bradford pear. Another thing when we're talking about creating this sustainable landscape is that when we see this field of, I'm not sure what that is, but the purple wildflowers, I mean, that's beautiful, and you get this really pretty pop of purple, but it's better if you mix a lot of species like you can see here. So the wildflower mixes that we can purchase that are going to be native, it's so much better again than planting one species in an area. And when we talk about natives, we've got about 2,400 native or naturalized plants in Tennessee. For a lot in the southeast, that's going to be very similar type plants, and a lot of these are available in nursery trade. I mean, I think we've got a couple of growers on here from Northeast Tennessee right now, and they always have an excellent diversity, a wide variety of plants to be able to choose from. Just some benefits of natives. Again, they're adapting to that local environment. They're not going to have the energy demands or the water demands that some of these other plants are going to have. You're not going to have to utilize a lot of chemical applications, be that herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, because they're just used to certain environmental conditions. And plus they're going to provide food and shelter for not only wildlife, but also oftentimes for you as well. So again, why does all this matter? Well, I'm going to bring it back to Tennessee since we're in Tennessee, but Tennessee's rich in natural resources and unique habitats. Again, we're a very water-rich state. We rank 13th among states in species diversity. About 3,800 species are what we provide a habitat for. Rank 4th in amphibian diversity. That's pretty cool. Frogs and salamanders. And then 2nd in freshwater fish diversity. And I'm not much of a fisherman. I grew up fishing and everything, but the trout, the brook and the mountain, rainbow trout, all of those, you know, they were even at one point kind of on the cusp of not being extinct, but kind of being overfished. The habitat was kind of in danger from outside environmental pollutants and stuff. Anyway, Tennessee ranks 9th in the country for total extinct species. So 22 of those are documented. So that's just some stats to kind of think about, but also just looking at the difference between pervious and impervious surfaces. So of course, when we're in our houses at home, we've got a lot of these pervious surfaces. Anytime it's impervious, that's going to be concrete, pavement, or anything like that. I'm not going to go into a lot of this because this will be more in depth if any of you participate in the Smart Yards start next week. But the big thing is just to notice the runoff difference. So again, the more that we can incorporate green space versus, you know, pavement, asphalt, whatever, we're going to reduce a lot of that surface runoff. It's also, this is going to be better for infiltration, which is going to stick into the soil more rather than just kind of staying in one area and being like stagnant. So kind of keep that in mind too as you're building things on your property. Anytime that you do have an impervious surface, incorporate some of those runoff principles that we talked about a little bit earlier. Because you can see here from just the effects, from just a green space, you've got 10% runoff versus into a city, you've got 55% runoff. So huge difference there. So just to kind of show you a few pictures here, and I don't know where this is at. Whoops, what did I do? But you notice here, I've spoken about the water's edge a little bit. Notice how there's really nothing, there's no buffering between the water and the turf here. There's a little bit of a berm here, but not much. Whereas if we were to come in and incorporate species along that water's edge, this is jewelweed, probably some kind of maple here, but all this lush vegetation, what happens when it rains? You know, again, it's kind of helping hold that bank in place. We don't have a lot of runoff that's occurring here. We're not losing precious soil, and our streams remain a lot clearer when you have this dense vegetation along the stream banks versus what you just have right here. This is going to get muddy really quick, and some of you have probably seen instances like that. But what we call this is a riparian buffer, and NRCS also can assist with some of these type issues. So I would encourage you to investigate those sources as well, and there'll be a link in the presentation for that. And those are going to be in every state, not just here in Tennessee. Just to kind of show you, this is a mow path. I think you can see that mowed through here. So again, we're talking about reducing the need to mow. So they've just let some of this go right through here and just created a mow path. But you could do this in wildflowers or whatever. Less time devoted to mowing. I'm not going to go through each one of these because this is going to be in your packet, but one of the things that I wanted to kind of show you, you see here at the top common practices and then examples of some sustainable alternatives. Well, you can see here by common practices routinely applying fertilizer and pesticides, and we've already kind of talked about that. But if you're doing a soil test, it's going to give you recommendations, and we have plant lists that can kind of help guide that process. Also raking, bagging, landfilling leaves or piling those up on the curb for folks to come get. Utilize those yourself. You know, utilize those to your advantage. Deadheading or removing all of those flowers, leave that through the winter months. And you can kind of see here because it's providing cover and a source of food for the birds through the winter time. And especially cardinals, they love any of that low growing browse, or even the briar plants, the winter creeper at my house. They'll even get into that where it's grown up and over some of the rocks in the back of the landscape. But again, just some keys to sustainability is just design to utilize and incorporate those natural resources and elements that's already in place. So you're not having to spend out of pocket. It's, again, you and your landscape working together to do this. Make sure that when you go to planting that they are sustainable plantings, incorporating those natives as much as can. Promote biodiversity. One thing I didn't mention was that when we are creating those mass plantings, or we've got a variety of plants in our landscape, that's also providing a habitat for many of our beneficial insects. They'll actually come in the summertime and eat some of those bad bugs that are feeding on in our garden. So anytime that we increase that biodiversity, that's what we're doing, is creating habitats for the good bugs or the good wildlife. Conservation of resources. You want to be able to, I don't know what that means, conservation of, that doesn't make sense, but okay, never mind. But again, maintaining those beneficial insects. We want to purchase plants that are going to be drought tolerant, disease and pest resistant, pollinator friendly, beneficial for wildlife, and again, low maintenance. And again, natives are what's really going to fit the course for this. So I wanted to not leave you tonight without showcasing a lot of our more common plants that you could use in a sustainable landscape. So just to make mention, of course, this is one every Tennessean should know, the Tennessee purple coneflower, Echinacea tennescensis. I can't ever say that right, so forgive me. But this is one that's actually endemic to the cedar glades out in Middle Tennessee near Lebanon. But it makes a really pretty addition to a landscape. This is one you've probably heard me mention several times, but this is butterfly weed or pleurisy root, depending on what area the state that you're coming from. But this is a must-have for our monarch butterflies. This serves as a beneficial host the milkweed plant. So this is a really good pollinator to have in the garden. If you like the hummingbirds, the wild blue indigo is an excellent addition. And you know, they say hummingbirds come back to the same place year after year. So again, it's about being consistent with that landscape, making sure that they do in fact have that food source when they return. This is one you've heard me mention several times. This is Joe Pieweed, and there are more cultivars on the market now, so you can even get a little bit different color. But this is beautiful in the fall, especially with ironweed and goldenrod. But this grows in like a wetter, swampier conditions. So it's going to be one of those kind of in a riparian buffer or in a lowland area in your landscape that you can plant that's going to thrive and be beautiful. It's going to serve as a pollinator, but it's going to be dual purpose. You know, it's going to help hold like a stream bank in place as well. And then this is our wild ageratum, or what we call bone set. This is not like the ageratums that you get at the box store, the annual plants. This is the actual wild ageratum. So a little bit of a distinction there, but this is really vigorous, perennial, excellent addition to the landscape. And that one's native. The annual plant is not. Just to mention some of these top perennial performers, many of you probably recognize this, the salvia. This is May night cultivar, but any of those salvias or the sages are going to be really nice additions. This one is a really pretty, kind of blew that picture up so you could see it a little bit better, but this is a Gara. This one is called the Bride. And then sedums, I didn't mention this from my landscape, but this was the only thing that was there when I first purchased my landscape was sedums, and they do really well in shallow soil. Some of these sedums will even grow on the rocks, multitude of colors, and they flourish, come back year after year, but flourish quite nicely. This is the crystal pink sedum. And then our coreopsis or tick seed, these will self-seed themselves. And then we have the elegance purple lavender. Not everybody can grow the lavender. It's kind of finicky as far as its soil conditions and light conditions, but some of those ground covers or the edgers that I was talking about a little bit earlier, these do really, really well in those situations. As far as some annual selections, if you've got some holes that you want to fill in, this is Combrina. This is the Aldrey Purple Red, and it spreads really nicely. It will self-seed, so you can save the seed from year to year, but it's just a nice fiery little addition, especially as a border to the garden. And then these are verbenas. Everybody probably knows verbena and the lantanas. So those are nice additions to kind of fill in and give you a pop of color. As well as this is Purple Evolution Salvia. So a little bit lighter color. It blooms later into the fall, like into September. The pineapple sage makes a really pretty addition with this, kind of intermingle those two for a hummingbird borders, kind of what I call it at home, but beautiful plumes of purple and red with the pineapple sage. Now, as far as a few ornamentals, you heard me mention the grass earlier because this is something we're starting to see an increase of. I first saw this in Palm Beach, Florida, I guess, a couple years ago when I went down there for a talk, the muhly grass, and come to find out it will actually grow here in Tennessee. So all you have to do in the springtime is just trim that back, but you can kind of see it provides some really nice contrast to what else they have going on there in the landscape. And you can kind of tell here it would be a nice, really a good cover for wildlife too. This is the Chast tree, or Vitex or Vitex, again, depending on where you're coming from. But if you've got a quirky little place in the corner of your landscape, it makes a really nice addition. And then this is an Abelia. You'll hear multiple, I guess, some conflicting thoughts on Abelia, but it can be a really nice plant and it adapts very well. Kind of some of those hard to reach places in the landscape, kind of a good fill-in type plant. And then this is one probably everybody recognizes, is the little lime hydrangea. And then we have the limelight hydrangeas, lots of different cultivars out there. But this is the one that's the little lime, so a little bit shorter in stature, but you can kind of see how they framed in their evergreens here. So really nice addition. Just to kind of show you some bad, and again, I'm not like going around and driving through all y'all's yards. So if this is any of y'all's places, just be quiet because I don't know if it's yours, okay? But I'm going to pick on a few people or a few things here. This is when I kind of wish we were all together so we could be more interactive and talk about this. But this is not an area I would really deem sustainable for a multitude of reasons. I mean, number one, just the turf. I mean, that could be a first step, is just establishing turf. I'm wondering if this is here as a walkway or if this is like some kind of drainage issue, especially with the gutter coming out there. You know, the raised beds, a lot that you could do there, probably having to maybe apply herbicide throughout the season. We just have a lot of empty space here. Even over here, you can kind of see, I don't know how much distance there is between there, but you know, there's just a lot that we could do to kind of improve this. And if this is a wet area, incorporating some of those plants that actually perform well in those wetter conditions. Same thing here, just a lot of bare turf areas. So even just evaluating turf species and incorporating that would be one step in the right direction for improving sustainability. But also, I kind of see that as, again, as a canvas. There's lots you could incorporate here in this area to make it much more sustainable. And you can kind of see here from that slope, I don't know if y'all can see that, kind of a smaller slope here. So even incorporating some kind of terraces, maybe taking out a few trees, just adding some diversity and some, you know, some pop of color would be good there. So just some before and after to kind of show you what some of these would look like. And again, let me just again reiterate that, you know, what I say is pretty or works nice or whatever doesn't mean that's the gospel, because we're all going to be very different in what our preferences and likes are, just as long as we're maintaining and adhering to those principles. So, you know, probably when you're seeing this, many of you are probably thinking, well, I think I would do this or I would do that. So this is what this individual ended up doing. So they do have some impervious surface here, but they're controlling that with the mulch around here. A huge variety of plants that you can see that they've incorporated, but they've created an outdoor living space that suits that family's needs, which is really cool. So again, that's just kind of beforehand, and then that's after. Here's one, and like I said, we woke up in Northeast Tennessee to this morning, just water everywhere. So they've taken this area and created a rain garden. So if this is something that interests you, again, we're going to spend a lot more time on this in the coming months, just about establishing these rain gardens. But so much nicer to look at than this, right? So, and although this is an expense, it's not an exorbitant expense when you really start including some of these plants. I mean, that's going to be an upfront cost, but the maintenance of this is actually going to be cheaper for you as a homeowner in the long run than what this can continue to be. Plus, just a valuable loss of our resources with this. Here's another. Now, this kind of strikes me that, hey, you know, I kind of like that. It's you know, vintage, homey, woodsy looking, but you know, the other side of me screams, oh my Lord, that's just a lot of waste here. So they've actually come in and created some stone steps for that. So again, a little bit more impervious, but kind of draining that water away. They're more in control of that versus here where when it rains, it's just, that's probably what's caused a lot of this issue, especially from up here and into this area where it's kind of sunk down. So by going in and kind of creating some of that, you're able to control that a little bit better and incorporate these plants that are natural to the landscape. You can see some of those here. And then again, just to show you some more examples, these are not before and after, but just to kind of show you what that looks like. A lot of visual contrast here, lots of different things going on. You've got a focal point here, you're growing vertical, as well as these trees back here in the background. You've got this fence here and a stone outcropping, but there's no empty space in here. And then you can also see this water feature. So don't know why that was incorporated. Could have been a wet area, or they just wanted a water feature, but you can see even the grasses here. So it looks like they have elements for all 4 seasons going on in this landscape. Same thing here. Notice this is probably not a good picture to be able to see this, but see how they've got the drainage. And so all of this is not running right into the lake. They've actually, again, they're controlling that water runoff. And a lot of this, when we talked about runoff, and I didn't really hit on infiltration earlier, but when it does rain, like what we had last night, the more of this kind of area we have versus this kind of area, and especially this kind of area, water is going to seep into the ground much slower here than it will here, and especially here, because of course it's just going to run off here, right? So the more that we can incorporate these type landscape beds, that's going to be better in the long run. Again, this is probably this is the natural slope, and they've included this water area just because it was natural to that landscape, and a lot more rocks. This kind of reminds me of my house a little bit, although not quite as steep, but kind of see how everything flows and fits into that landscape. It doesn't look like it's too busy. It looks like it's a part of the natural landscape. And again, that's what sustainable landscape is doing. We're mimicking what Mother Nature has. So of course, Mother Nature is not going to have this, but it's better than that picture I showed you a couple minutes ago, water just sitting there in a hole. So again, the landscape is kind of dictating what you can do, but you can do some of these really cool elements with it in the long run. Again, this is just an excellent portrayal of the visual and the diversity, the visual aspects, a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of different plants and visual appeal. You've got grasses and ornamentals. You've even got some the ornamental cabbages and things like that in here, but it's kind of framing and setting off that house. It's a really nice visual curb appeal. And notice the pink flamingo back here in the corner. And this is, if you're into the more rustic look, this is like a more of a cottage garden. So lots of pollinators, probably some wetland area here. I don't know if that's blurry to y'all. That looks blurry to me, but incorporating even sunflowers, which would be an annual throughout the season to kind of fill in some of those holes, some of those other annuals we talked about a little while ago. But this could be just an area that they've converted their lawn to this area. I don't really know if there's a lawn over here or not, but you can kind of see how that works. For some people that might be, you know, a little junky to them. They might not prefer this. They want it more manicured, but hopefully you can see from all of these, there's something for everyone. Just depends on what suits your needs. And again, this is just an example of those berms we were talking about, kind of building that up a little bit here. And again, just some good visual interest, and one with the water, lots of lily pads, utilizing that feature. So again, we've gotten more pricey as we've gone through these last few slides. I guess you've kind of been able to tell that. But again, it's having that checklist and kind of putting that plan in place, because like I said, you're not going to be able to do all of these at one time. So it's just kind of moving through the seasons. And another cool thing is if you're don't have a lot of space, you can even incorporate the sustainable landscape practices with your raised garden beds. You can see how these beds are permanent structures, and they've been framed in quite nicely by the rest of their landscape here. And they've grown up in their raised beds, so they can get a lot more in those raised beds. And again, when I was talking about kind of blending your landscape in with whatever is next to it, you can kind of see that from that fence there, but just kind of blending outward. It's not just a stark stop and go. So it's just kind of blending in with that natural environment. And even taking a steeper bank and being able to incorporate this, you're getting a lot more infiltration there rather than that runoff, which is what we want to do, is conserve our water resources. And again, about that water's edge, you can notice here, Lots of vegetation here. This walk path is built upward. You're not mowing right down to the water's edge, and that's going to be really important, whether it's a stream, a ditch, a pond, or whatever you've got on your property. Make sure that you've always got some kind of buffer zone between you and that turf or anything else. Now, I know that this was a lot tonight, but hopefully it's just showing you some of those basic principles to kind of get you thinking about things in the next few weeks. But we do have a couple of new publications out, and this is what I was talking about. This is one for annuals and biennials, and then we also have one for perennials, but we don't have a lot of pictures in there. So that March 15th is what I'm thinking about coming in and just showing you pictures of all of those so you can kind of see what they look like. So like I say, when you get that email tonight, just let me know if that's something you're interested in, because I don't care to jump on and do that live with y'all. But these are fairly new publications, and even if you're not in Tennessee, you can look at the zone and be able to tell if these would perform in your area. These are tried and true. We know that these perform really well. Another thing just to make mention before that is that I speak a lot about natives. So in your, actually it is on here. Let me see. All of these resources, you can just click on these. You're going to get a link to this web portal. And tonight's video will go right here as soon as I get it edited and uploaded. So you can go back and watch it later. But all of these publications are here. Just point and click. But there is some native plants for Tennessee. But we're going to spend more time on that. I want to devote more time on that whenever that class is scheduled, talking about more natives. I just feel like we need to give that a little bit more time than throwing it in here tonight or even on the 15th. But do kind of review that. And if you have questions about any of those, don't hesitate to reach out. But these are some really good resources for you to be able to utilize. And that is all I have for tonight. Let's see here. Let me stop share. There we go. So I noticed that the chat box kept lighting up. So I'll go in and answer all those questions and make sure you get links to all these tonight. And just remember, next week we're not live via Zoom, but I'm going to be sharing the Tennessee Smart Yards with y'all. So if any of this kind of resonated with you, hopefully you'll really look at that Smart Yards curriculum and get into that. You can probably tell of the Smart Yards, we have 9 principles, and one of those is protect the water's edge. So you can probably tell where my, I guess where my opinion lies with all of that. That's where I'm a little bit more proficient. I really like to be able to protect our water's edge. I feel like it's really important. So anyway, just enjoy your week, and I will see you maybe on the 15th. If not, I'll see you on the 22nd. And don't hesitate to reach out with questions. You'll get a link to our Ask Us Tonight as well. So I enjoyed it. I'll see y'all in a couple of weeks.